There are more than 1 million domestic workers in South Africa who perform essential work like cooking, cleaning, caring for children and the elderly, as well as some gardening as well. Domestic work makes all other work possible as it allows people to leave their households and go out in the world to make a living. We have, of course, over the years been reporting on domestic workers and their rights and the minimum wages imposed by the Department of Labour. And it's very seldom that we talk about the rights of domestic workers' employers themselves. The beginning of every new year brings pain and sorrow to the many employers who find themselves having to make alternative arrangements because of their domestic workers or nannies who had failed to let them know on time that they will not be returning to work. This, of course, becomes a huge inconvenience and a nightmare for others. And what many others have been saying is, why could they not just let me know on time that they will not be returning to work? We look at what may be the rights of employers, or what you may do if you find yourself in a similar situation. Unfortunately, we had invited the Domestic Workers Union. The deputy chairperson had promised to come, but she has not made it. But we have Egi Muyula, who is the Inspector General from the Department of Labour, who would talk to us more about this. Good afternoon to you, Muyula. Thank you so much for coming through.
Afternoon, Palisa. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much indeed. As I said on my introduction, that this is a problem that many employers are sitting with, more so at the beginning of the year. They go home during the December holidays and they never come back, but they never bother to tell their employers that they would not be returning. So what should I do as an employer when I find myself in such a situation?
First of all, maybe to premise the whole talk by saying that the Department of Labour has got a set of laws that unfortunately, should I say, that, or fortunately, we are pro the vulnerable, and the domestic sector is such a sector where you find the large deposit of people that work there are by and large vulnerable. And you can define vulnerability in various ways, but the one definition would be that if you look at the power base, for instance, employers are in a more powerful position than the employees. Having said that, however, we always say as a department that the employers have got a right to demand a particular service for the money that they're paying. And most of the time our experience has been that this part is left to chance and it's not really well managed. And my advice would be to say that as an employer, make sure that you've got a contract that is in place and a contract that is going to be signed by both parties. If you go to the Department of Labour website, we've got a pro forma of the type of a contract so that you know what is it that you're signing up for. But to answer your question specifically, in terms of domestic workers that can just decide not to pitch up and not even give you a notice, unfortunately that goes by and large with a person's work ethic. I mean, if you go with, if I use the department as an example, that some employees, much as they've got a contract with the department, they can just throw in a 24-hour notice. Yeah. So there isn't anything.
But at least that is a notice. Yes. In this instance, they just don't bother. You'd find their phones are switched off at that particular moment when they have to return to work. But now you made mention of drawing up a binding contract. Yeah. How can such a contract assist in this instance? The contract is quite detailed because it regulates a lot of things. Issues of remuneration, even issues of notices. Because domestic workers, like any other worker, have got a right to give in a notice when they feel they want to go. But the contract clearly states, in line with the law, that at least a week's notice at minimum should be given. But unfortunately, you do find that there are instances where that is not even abided with. But in terms of the law, there is nothing that could enforce that. Yeah. Because I wanted to say that if a person just decides to abscond, really there isn't really much that one can do, isn't it?
No, there isn't anything much that you can do in terms of the law. Like I said earlier on, it really depends on a person's ethics. You know? So
does this mean that, of course, it leaves the employers very vulnerable? You were saying at the beginning of the conversation that domestic workers are a vulnerable group, but do you not find the employers vulnerable as well if it's the morning, the school reopens, your nanny is supposed to be there, she's nowhere to be found, her phone switched off? You become vulnerable, of course, at that particular moment as well.
I understand what you're saying, but the spirit of our laws are looking into vulnerability in terms of, because one of the things that you need to look at is the rate of unionization and the voice that a domestic worker has got. So our law, in essence, are trying to premise everything on the fact that it takes care of the vulnerable, as well as making sure that those that do not have a voice are well taken care of. And I think that it is also the responsibility of the employer, that an employer person, do your homework, make sure that at least you're employing somebody that has got a good track record. And you can be able to do that because the expectation is that when a person had been working, there must be a certificate that shows that they had worked, and that should also tell you something about the type of track record that they've
We were
got.
having this conversation, of course, prior to this interview in the office, and one of the colleagues was telling us that a friend's nanny had stolen things, furniture, and so this shows that we really need to do proper check before we hire a domestic workers.
Proper check, reference check, make sure that you know who you're hiring, so that at least you also have yourself covered. Because sometimes we leave these things to chance. You get a person in your house, you give them access to your house, they know things, even personal
They run the house, the executives of the house.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you find that you hardly know where they come from, you haven't done a check, a thorough check, and so those things need to be.
But one could say that if I were to fire my nanny or my domestic worker now, when I knock off and then I fire her, she would be running to the Department of Labor and saying that this is unfair dismissal. But if she does that to me as an employer, it's a different story altogether, which sounds a bit unfair, isn't it?
I hear what you're saying, but obviously if you fire your domestic worker and it's unfair, she's got all the rights. Like I said earlier on, our laws are vulnerability. And I'm sure, that understand.
So the bottom line is there isn't really much that one can do if your domestic worker just decides to leave.
Not really. Not really. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Okay. I suppose, of course, this will be a conversation for another day. But thank you so much for coming through.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much indeed. Well, there you have it. That's Egi Muilwa. She is the Inspector General from the Department of Labor, talking to us about your rights as an employer of domestic workers. So